Welcome to TruthCraft, a channel devoted to pursuing the truth while playing Minecraft. In this video, I want to talk with you about a very strange argument for God's existence. It's called the ontological argument, and many people find it ridiculous, although some few oddballs, myself included, I'll say, find it compelling. But from my experience, most people that hear this argument are simply confused and maybe feel that they've been tricked. The argument comes from the 11th century Archbishop of Canterbury, Anselm. It's certainly the most enduring philosophical contribution that he made, but oddly enough, the argument itself takes up a very small portion of his famous work, the Proslogion. Now, just like last time, make sure you stick around for the whole video, because I'm going to address an objection given by someone who's actually a contemporary of Anselm, and it's the main objection that's also given today. But first, I'll read you what Anselm himself says. This is a bit of a lengthy quote, but I think it'll help us wrap our minds around what he's trying to communicate. This is from the Proslogion. Well then, Lord, you who give understanding to faith, grant me that I may understand as much as you see fit, that you exist as we believe you to exist, and that you are what we believe you to be. Now we believe that you are something than which nothing greater can be thought. Or can it be that a thing of such a nature does not exist, since the fool has said in his heart, there is no God? But surely when the same fool hears what I am speaking about, namely, something than which nothing greater can be thought, he understands what he hears, and what he understands is in his mind, even if he does not understand that it actually exists. For it is one thing for an object to exist in the mind, and another thing to understand that an object actually exists. Thus, when a painter plans beforehand what he is going to execute, he has the picture in his mind, but he does not yet think that it actually exists because he has not yet executed it. However, when he has actually painted it, then he both has it in his mind and understands that it exists because he has now made it. Even the fool, then, is forced to agree that something than which nothing greater can be thought exists in the mind, since he understands this when he hears it. And whatever is understood is in the mind. And surely that than which a greater cannot be thought cannot exist in the mind alone. For if it exists solely in the mind, it can be thought to exist in reality also, which is greater. If then that than which a greater cannot be thought exists in the mind alone, this same that than which a greater cannot be thought is that than which a greater can be thought. But this is obviously impossible. Therefore, there is absolutely no doubt that something than which a greater cannot be thought exists both in the mind and in reality. In simple terms, Anselm invites us to consider a being that is perfectly great in every aspect. This being would have all the best qualities, and he would have them to the full. He would be perfectly loving, perfectly good, perfectly just, but also perfectly powerful, perfectly knowledgeable, and so on. Now imagine for a moment that there was no such being. Well, if this being didn't exist, then in fact they are not the perfectly great being, since it would be better for this being to exist than not to exist. Existence is better than non-existence, especially when it comes to a being perfect in all of its qualities. So then we are met with a contradiction. I can think of the perfectly great being, but this being does not exist, making it not perfectly great. The conclusion that Anselm draws from this is that the perfectly great being must exist, since if it didn't exist, we run into a logical contradiction. This perfectly great being we call God. This argument is called a reductio ad absurdum, and philosophically it's pretty slick if you can pull this off. It's basically a backwards argument asking you to choose between two alternatives. By showing the inherent absurdity in one of the alternatives, we deduce that the other alternative must be the correct one. Now, at this point, you might be a bit skeptical. Maybe it feels like Anselm has pulled the wool over your eyes a little. And that's exactly what a contemporary monk thought of Anselm's argument. Though this monk believed in God, he thought Anselm's reasoning was off. He provides a counterexample to Anselm's argument, demonstrating, in his mind, that Anselm's argument is false. This is what he writes. For example, they say that there is in the ocean somewhere an island which, because of the difficulty, or rather the impossibility of finding that which does not exist, some have called the Lost Island. And the story goes that it is blessed with all manner of priceless riches and delights in abundance, much more even than the Happy Isles, and having no owner or inhabitant, it is superior everywhere in abundance of riches to all those other lands that men inhabit. Now, if anyone tell me that it is like this, I shall easily understand what is said, since nothing is difficult about it. But if you should then go on to say, as though it were a logical consequence of this, you cannot any more doubt that this island that is more excellent than all other lands truly exists somewhere in reality, than you can doubt that it is in your mind. And since it is more excellent to exist not only in the mind alone, but also in reality, therefore it must needs be that it exists. For if it did not exist, any other land existing in reality would be more excellent than it. And so this island, already conceived by you to be more excellent than others, will not be more excellent. So what's this monk trying to demonstrate? And the monk's name is Gonillo, by the way. Well, Gonillo thinks it's a little hard to tell where Anselm's logic is wrong, but he provides an example about an island somewhere in the middle of the ocean, and he basically does the exact same thing that Anselm does. Well, this island is the greatest island you could possibly imagine. It has all the riches and treasures and food you could ever want. And because it's so great that nothing could be greater, that no island could be greater, then it must exist in reality too, because it would be better for it to exist in reality than to exist only in your mind. And since it's the greatest island you could possibly think of, if it existed only in your mind, you run into the same logical contradiction that Anselm points out with God, since it's not as good if it exists in your mind as if it exists in reality. Therefore, it's in fact not the greatest island you could ever think of. So this reasoning seems to make it clear that Anselm's logic has to be wrong somewhere, right? Well, Anselm didn't think so, and in fact, he gave a reply to Gonillo that you can find in his major works, published by Oxford World's Classics. I'm not going to read anything from that. It's a little bit too densely argued, and it would simply take too long. But the gist of his point is to argue that the island is not relevant, nor could any created thing be relevant to this discussion, since it is impossible for an island or any created thing to have every perfectly great attribute or quality. Basically, Anselm acknowledges that if you apply this argument to anything other than that than which nothing greater can be thought, indeed, you will not arrive at the truth, and it can't be applied to anything else. It can only be applied to a being who is ontologically perfect in every aspect, which includes, by the way, not having a beginning and never being created. It is this being that must exist in reality if it exists also in the mind, because it's ontologically above all other beings. And I'll leave it to Anselm to explain the rest. Now, this argument tries to prove a lot with a very little, and we might think that's an indication of its falsehood, maybe even its naivety. On the other hand, what if it's so simple because it's true? What if it's impossible to rationally imagine a world without God because, well, God created everything in the world, including the way our minds think? Acts 17:28 says, "In him, that is in God, we live and move and have our being." If we exist only in God and by God's power, then it's certainly reasonable to believe that acknowledging God's existence is the only rational option. So, what do you think of the ontological argument? Do you love it or do you hate it? Because I imagine there's really no in-between.